There is a particular kind of person you have probably met at least once. Someone who, in the middle of an argument, simply stops. Not because they have nothing to say, not because they lost, but because something in them decided, quietly, without announcement, that the argument itself was no longer worth entering. You watched them go still, and something about that stillness unsettled you. Maybe you called it coldness. Maybe you called it arrogance. Maybe, in a more honest moment, you called it something you didn't have a name for. A kind of composure that felt almost inhuman, because it did not need anything from you. What you were looking at was not indifference. It was something far older and far stranger than that. The Stoics had a word for it, not a feeling, not a technique. A state of being they spent their entire lives trying to understand, and that the people around them almost never could. This is where we begin. You already know what it feels like to be misread. Not misunderstood in the way everyone is misunderstood sometimes, where someone gets the facts wrong or jumps to the wrong conclusion and a conversation fixes it. This is different. This is the particular exhaustion of being someone whose stillness is read as absence, whose silence is read as judgment, whose refusal to react is read as proof that they do not care. When the truth, the one you have been carrying for years, is almost the opposite. You care. You have always cared. But somewhere along the way, you learned that reacting and caring are not the same thing. That you can hold something with enormous weight inside you and still choose not to perform that weight for the room. And yet, the room keeps asking you to perform it. This is the wound underneath the misreading. Not that people see you wrongly, but that the world has built an entire grammar around emotional display, and anyone who does not speak that grammar fluently is assumed to be empty, rather than simply different. Think about the last time someone said you were cold. What they almost certainly meant was, you did not give me the reaction I needed to feel safe. You did not mirror my panic back to me so I could believe my panic was justified. You stayed somewhere I could not reach, and that distance frightened me, and fear, when it cannot locate its source, becomes accusation. The accusation was never really about you. It was about what your composure exposed in them. This is the first thing the Stoics understood that almost no one else wanted to admit. That emotional reactivity, in most social situations, is not honesty. It is a form of social currency. A performance of feeling that tells the people around you, I am like you. I am safe. I am legible. And when you withdraw from that performance, not out of cruelty, but out of something more like integrity, you become threatening. Not because you have done anything wrong, because you have quietly refused to do something everyone else agreed to do without ever discussing it. The Stoics called the state they were cultivating apatheia. The word has come down to us as apathy, flat, grey, unmoved. And that translation has done centuries of damage to what the idea actually was. Apatheia did not mean the absence of feeling. It meant the absence of being ruled by feeling. There is a difference so significant that collapsing it changes everything. A person in apatheia could grieve, could love, could be moved by beauty or disturbed by injustice. What they could not be, what they trained themselves over years not to be, was thrown by those states, controlled by them, carried somewhere they had not chosen to go. Epictetus, who was born into slavery and taught philosophy in Rome, described it this way: some things are in our power and some things are not. What is in our power is our response, our judgment, our intention, the quality of attention we bring. What is not in our power is everything outside that narrow, sovereign territory. Everything else. The weather, the opinions of others, the outcomes of our work, the length of our lives, the loyalty of people we love, everything. When you understand that framing, really understand it, not as an idea, but as a felt orientation to being alive, the composure that looks like coldness from the outside begins to make a different kind of sense. It is not detachment from life. It is an unusually precise relationship with what life actually contains and what it does not. But here is what the Stoics did not fully prepare you for. Living that way, in a world that does not, is its own form of isolation. Not the isolation of not caring, the isolation of caring differently, of holding things at a depth that does not translate easily into the social registers everyone around you is using. The isolation of watching someone spiral and knowing, with a quiet certainty you cannot always explain, that the spiral will pass, and that your joining it will not help them, only comfort them temporarily at the cost of your own ground. That knowledge is a kind of loneliness, and it is the loneliness almost no one who has written about Stoicism bothers to name. Because it is easier to write about strength than about the specific sadness of being strong in a way no one asked for, in rooms full of people who experience your steadiness as a closed door. You have felt that sadness, even if you never gave it that name. And what you may not yet know is that the Stoics felt it too, and that what they built in response was not a wall, but something far more interesting. Something that required them to look directly at the thing most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. There is a moment most people cannot locate precisely, but recognize immediately when you describe it. The moment you understood for the first time that your feelings were not entirely your own. Not in a dramatic sense, not a revelation, more like a slow noticing. That the anxiety you carried into a room sometimes belonged to the room. That the guilt you woke up with on certain mornings had been handed to you, carefully, by someone who needed you to carry it. That the urgency you felt to fix things, to smooth things, to say the right words quickly before the silence became unbearable, that urgency was not yours either. It had been installed. This is what the Stoics were pointing at, underneath all the philosophy, underneath the elegant Latin and the marble busts and the centuries of commentary. The recognition that most of what we call our emotional life is not, in any meaningful sense, self-generated. It is a series of inherited responses to inherited expectations, running so automatically, so fluently, that we mistake them for personality. We mistake the installation for the self, and the cost of that mistake is almost impossible to overstate. Because when your feelings are not your own, when they are primarily responses to what others need you to feel, performances of states that keep the social world stable and predictable, you do not actually know where you end and the expectation begins. You have no ground, only weather, only the constant, exhausting work of reading the room and adjusting, reading the room and adjusting, until the adjustment becomes so automatic that you no longer experience it as effort. You experience it as simply being a person. The Stoics had a different name for it. They called it living according to nature. But they meant something precise by nature, something that has almost nothing to do with how that phrase sounds today. They did not mean living simply, or retreating from society, or following instinct. They meant living in accordance with what is actually, genuinely yours. Your reason, your judgment, your capacity to pause between what happens and how you respond. That pause, that narrow, almost invisible space between stimulus and reaction, that is the territory the Stoics were mapping. Marcus Aurelius returned to it obsessively in his private journals, the ones he never intended anyone to read, the ones that became the Meditations. He was, by any measure, one of the most powerful men alive during his lifetime. He commanded armies, administered an empire, presided over the deaths of people he loved. And yet, what he wrote about, night after night, was not power. It was the interior question, the discipline of the interior. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But notice what that sentence actually demands. It does not say, stop caring about outside events. It does not say, become someone who is unmoved by loss, by injustice, by the cruelty of other people. It says, locate, clearly and honestly, where your power actually lives, and stop placing it somewhere it cannot survive. Most of us were never taught to do that. We were taught the opposite. We were taught that love means being affected, that loyalty means feeling what the other person feels, that caring about something means being devastated when it goes wrong. The entire emotional education most people receive, at home, in school, through every story culture tells about what it means to be a good and feeling person, trains them to locate their center of gravity outside themselves, in outcomes, in approval, in the continued presence of things that were always going to change. And so, when something changes, when the approval withdraws, when the outcome disappoints, when the person leaves, the ground goes too. Not because the loss is not real, but because the ground was never actually yours. This is the wound the Stoics were addressing, not the wound of being too sensitive or too emotional or too attached, the language most people use, which carries a quiet cruelty inside it. The wound of having been taught to build your interior life on foundations you were never given control over, and then being surprised when those foundations move. You were not weak. You were building on someone else's land. And what the Stoics were offering, what sits underneath all the philosophy about virtue and reason and the common good, was something more like a quiet, radical act of reclamation. Come back inside, not away from the world, inside yourself, to the place that was always there, always yours, always waiting, underneath every performance and every adjustment, and every morning you woke up already braced for what the day would need from you. That place is not cold. It only looks cold from outside. There is a difference between feeling grief and being grief. Most people have never been taught to notice that difference, not because they are not intelligent enough or not self-aware enough, but because the culture they grew up inside had no real language for it. Emotion, in the world most of us inherited, is something that happens to you. It arrives, it takes over, and you either express it or suppress it. Those are the two options on the table: express or suppress. Feel loudly or go numb. The Stoics were proposing something else entirely, not expression, not suppression. Something more like witnessing, the capacity to feel the full weight of something without being relocated by it, to let grief move through you without becoming a grieving person, to let anger arrive without becoming an angry person, to notice the feeling as information rather than as instruction. This is not a small distinction. When emotion is instruction, when the arrival of fear means you must immediately act to make the fear stop, when the arrival of anger means you must immediately find somewhere to put it, when the arrival of longing means you must immediately pursue the thing you are longing for, you are not living your life. You are being lived by it. You are a series of responses to stimuli dressed in the clothing of a person. The Stoics called the state they were moving toward equanimity. Not happiness, not peace in the comfortable sense, the sense that nothing is wrong. Equanimity in the original sense, an evenness of mind that does not depend on the evenness of circumstances. You can be in the middle of something terrible and still have access to yourself. That is what they meant. And this is where people who do not understand Stoicism from the inside make the same mistake, reliably, every time. They look at that equanimity and they call it cold, because they are measuring it against a standard that says the depth of your feeling is proved by the visibility of your feeling. That grief is only real if it breaks you. That love is only real if its loss destroys you. that caring is only real if it costs you your ground. By that standard, yes, the Stoic is cold. But ask yourself who built that standard and who it actually serves. Because what it produces in practice is a world where the most emotionally reactive person in the room controls the room, where the one who escalates sets the terms, where composure is treated as a provocation and being unshakable is indistinguishable to the frightened eye from being uncaring. You have lived inside that dynamic. You know exactly what it costs. The Stoics knew too. Seneca wrote letters, hundreds of them, to a younger man named Lucilius, and what runs through those letters, underneath all the philosophy, is a tiredness that feels entirely contemporary. The tiredness of someone who has understood something true about how to live, and who must still live surrounded by people who have not, and who will not thank you for the understanding. He wrote about time with a precision that still lands. Not about managing time, about recognizing that most of what we call living is actually waiting. Waiting for the right circumstances, the right moment, the right person to arrive before we allow ourselves to be fully present in our own lives. He called it the theft of the self, the way we give away in small increments the only thing that was ever truly ours. The present moment and the quality of attention we bring to it. Everything else, the reputation, the outcomes, the approval, the legacy, he placed in a category he called preferred indifference. Things that are reasonable to pursue, even pleasant to have, but not things on which your interior life should depend. Not things worth sacrificing your ground for. That word, indifferent, is the one that still gets Stoics misread. Not indifferent as in, it does not matter. Indifferent as in, it does not get to decide whether I am intact. There is a version of you that already knows the difference. You have felt it, in the moments when something went wrong and you surprised yourself by not falling. When the news arrived and you stayed present. When the room expected collapse and you offered stillness instead. Not because you did not feel it, but because somewhere inside you, the ground held. That was not coldness. That was the thing the Stoics spent their entire lives trying to describe. Here is the contradiction no one warns you about. The moment you stop needing the room's approval, the room stops knowing what to do with you. This is not a metaphor. It is a social mechanism, and it operates with extraordinary precision. Human groups, families, friendships, workplaces, cultures, are held together in large part by mutual emotional legibility. By the unspoken agreement that we will react in recognizable ways, that our distress will be visible, that our desire for approval will keep us in a certain orbit around the people whose approval we need. When someone exits that orbit, not dramatically, not with announcement, but simply and quietly, the group feels it before it can name it. And what it names it, almost always, is a problem with the person who left. You became too distant, too serious, too difficult to read. You think you are better than everyone. You have changed. That last one is often true, but change in the direction of interior freedom is not what most social structures are built to reward. They are built to reward legibility, consistency, the kind of reliability that comes from remaining slightly dependent on approval, on belonging, on the continuous confirmation that you are liked, that you are included, that you are safe inside the group. The Stoic, by definition, has begun to disentangle from that confirmation, and the price is real. Marcus Aurelius was emperor of Rome for nearly 2 decades. He had more power than almost any person who has ever lived, and he wrote, in private, about the loneliness of a mind that could not find its match. Not because he was arrogant. The Meditations are almost painfully free of arrogance, which is part of what makes them strange to read. But because there is a particular solitude that comes with having done the interior work, and finding that the world around you is still running on a different operating system. He kept doing it anyway. That is the part that matters, not the loneliness, the keeping going. The decision, renewed each morning, to live from the inside out rather than the outside in, regardless of whether anyone around you understood what that meant, or valued it, or even noticed. The Stoics called this the discipline of assent, the capacity to pause in that narrow space between what happens and how you respond, and choose consciously which judgments you are willing to accept. Not to feel nothing, but to refuse the automatic translation of feeling into reaction, to say, in effect, "This has happened, I feel this, and now I will decide what I actually think about it, rather than simply being carried wherever the feeling goes." That pause is harder than it sounds, because the feeling does not arrive labeled. It arrives as urgency, as certainty, as the absolute conviction that what you are feeling right now is not a feeling, but a fact. That the threat is real, that the rejection is final, that the silence means what you are afraid it means. And the discipline of assent asks you, in that exact moment, to hold it lightly. Not to deny it, not to argue with it, but to refuse to treat it as the last word. This is where Stoicism becomes genuinely difficult, not as philosophy, but as practice. Because the world will keep offering you evidence for the urgency. The person really did leave. The opportunity really did close. The thing you feared really did happen. And the Stoic position is not that these things do not matter. It is that they do not get to determine what you are. There is a line in the Meditations that Marcus Aurelius returned to in different forms across years of writing. The idea that you always have the option of having no opinion. That the things outside you do not have the power to force a judgment from you. That the door, as he put it, is always open. He meant it as liberation. Most people read it as coldness. And this is the contradiction at the center of everything. The freedom the Stoics were describing is real, and it is hard-won, and it looks, from outside, almost indistinguishable from not caring. Because caring, in the grammar most people speak, requires vulnerability to outcome, requires that the possibility of loss have the power to undo you. And the Stoic has quietly, carefully, at some cost, removed that power. Not from cruelty, not from fear, but from the slow understanding that giving that power away was never actually protecting them, or anyone else. It was only making everyone feel less alone in their unsteadiness, and that is not the same as love, even when it feels like it. There is something almost no one says about people who do not collapse. That their steadiness is not distance. It is a different kind of arrival. Think about the people in your life who have been truly present with you in a hard moment. Not the ones who matched your panic, who escalated with you, who added their own fear to yours until the room was full of it. But the ones who stayed level, who did not flinch, who were somehow able to hold what was happening without being destroyed by it, and whose presence, for that reason, made you feel less alone rather than more. That steadiness was not absence of feeling. It was a quality of attention that only becomes possible when you are not simultaneously managing your own reaction. This is what gets lost in every conversation about Stoic coldness. The assumption that emotional reactivity and emotional presence are the same thing. That the person who cries with you is more there than the person who stays still. That being affected visibly is the same as caring deeply. But you have felt the difference. You know what it is to be with someone whose composure made space for you, and you know what it is to be with someone whose reaction made the moment about them, even when it was supposed to be about you. The Stoics were building something that our language has no clean word for. Not detachment, not indifference, something closer to what certain contemplative traditions would later call equanimous presence. The capacity to be fully with another person's pain without either performing sympathy or being consumed by it. To witness without collapsing. To remain a stable point in someone else's instability, not because you do not feel it, but because you have developed enough interior ground to feel it without losing yourself inside it. This is, in practice, one of the rarest things one person can offer another, and it is almost always misread as coldness by the people who need it most. Because what people in pain often want, in the immediate moment, is not steadiness. It is confirmation. They want to see their own distress reflected back at them, amplified slightly, so they know it is real. They want the other person to be undone by what has undone them, because that undoing is a form of validation. The Stoic cannot offer that, not because they do not care, but because they have learned to distinguish between what comforts in the short term and what actually helps, between the validation of shared panic and the rarer, quieter gift of a presence that does not need the panic to be real in order to take the pain seriously. Epictetus, who had every reason to be defined by what had been done to him, taught his students something that cuts against every instinct social life produces. He taught them that the event and the interpretation of the event are not the same thing. That between what happens and what you decide it means, there is always a space. And in that space, however small, however difficult to locate in the moment, lives the only freedom that cannot be taken from you. He had been a slave. He knew what could be taken. What remained, he said, was always enough. That is not a comfortable teaching. It does not flatter the wound. It does not say, what happened to you was not that bad, or you should be over it by now. It says something harder and, in the end, more respectful. What happened to you does not have to be the last word about who you are. You are not the sum of what has been done to you. You are the quality of attention you bring to what comes next. This is the reframe that changes everything, not as an idea you understand intellectually, but as something that lands in the body, in the place where the old story lives. Because the old story is almost always the same story, underneath all its variations. That you are at the mercy of something outside yourself. That your steadiness depends on the world behaving in a way you can bear. That love requires vulnerability to loss in the sense of being destroyed by it, not merely moved by it. The Stoics were saying, no. Not coldly, not as a rejection of love or grief or the full weight of being alive, but as a quiet, radical insistence that there is a you underneath all of that, and that you have always been enough to come back to. If you have stayed with me this far, I want to pause for just a moment, not to interrupt what we are building here, but because if this is landing for you, if something in what we have been tracing together feels like a recognition rather than just an idea, then this channel exists for exactly that. For the people who need more than inspiration, who need the actual map. Subscribe if you haven't yet. It matters more than it sounds. And now, back to where we were. Because there is something about the Stoic practice that almost every summary of it gets wrong. It is not a destination. The people who write about Stoicism as though it is a personality type, as though some people simply are Stoic, the way some people are tall, have missed the entire point of what Marcus Aurelius was doing when he wrote the Meditations. He was not recording his achievements. He was not documenting a state he had reached. He was practicing. Night after night, in a private journal no one was meant to read, one of the most powerful men in the ancient world was writing the same instructions to himself. Return to what is yours. Do not be carried. Remember what you can and cannot control. Begin again. Begin again. That repetition is not weakness. it is the entire practice. Because the Stoics understood something about human psychology that most modern self-improvement culture refuses to accept. That insight does not accumulate the way information does. You cannot learn equanimity once and keep it. You cannot have a realization about the dichotomy of control and then simply live from that realization forever without effort. The mind returns to its defaults, always. And so the practice is not achieving a state. It is the daily, sometimes hourly work of noticing when you have drifted, when you have given your ground away again, when you have located your stability in something outside yourself again, when you are waiting for the outcome to tell you whether you are allowed to be intact, and returning, without drama, without self-punishment, just returning. This is what the Stoics called the discipline of desire, not the suppression of wanting, but the gradual, careful work of examining what you are actually pursuing and why, and whether the pursuing itself is pulling you away from the only ground that was ever real. Seneca wrote about this with a precision that feels almost uncomfortable to read, because it names something most of us spend enormous energy not naming. He wrote about the person who is always busy, always moving, always pursuing, always preparing for the next thing, and he asked, with a quietness that lands harder than any accusation, "Where are you going? And when you arrive, what will you do with the stillness?" Because the stillness is the thing most people are fleeing, not consciously, not with intention, but the relentlessness of modern life. The filling of every silence with sound, every pause with productivity, every moment of potential aloneness with connection, is not ambition. It is, in many cases, the terror of arriving somewhere quiet and discovering that you do not know how to be with yourself. The Stoics were training for that silence, not to become empty inside it, but to discover that the emptiness, when you finally stop fleeing it, is not empty at all. It is the place where the actual self lives, the one that was there before the approval, before the performance, before you learned which version of you the room could tolerate and began, slowly and without noticing, to become mostly that version. And here is what that practice costs, not in difficulty, but in honesty. It requires you to look, clearly and without softening it, at the places where you are still trading your ground for something outside yourself. The relationship where your sense of worth depends on a particular response. The work where your sense of value depends on a particular outcome. The version of yourself you perform for people who would not recognize the quieter, stranger, more accurate version underneath. It does not ask you to abandon any of it. It asks you to see it, because you cannot return to ground you have not admitted you left. And most people spend their entire lives constructing elaborate explanations for why they had no choice but to leave, why the situation required it, why the person needed it, why it was love and not fear that moved them out of themselves and into whatever the room was asking for. The Stoic looks at that explanation with a kind of clear, unhurried attention and asks very quietly, "Is that true? Is that actually true?" You already know the answer. That is the part no one tells you about this kind of work, that the knowing comes first. Long before the changing, long before the practice, long before you have any reliable access to the ground the Stoics were describing, the knowing arrives, quietly, without fanfare, in the middle of a conversation where you are performing the reaction someone needs from you. Something underneath watches and knows. In the moment you say yes to something that costs you yourself, something underneath registers the cost and knows. In the morning you wake up already braced, already adjusting, already scanning for what the day will need from you before you have taken a single breath that belongs entirely to you. Something underneath notices and knows. That something is not a problem to be solved. It is the self the Stoics were pointing at, not the constructed self, not the legible self, the one that learned which reactions keep the room safe and which silences are too threatening to hold. The one underneath that, the one that has been watching, quietly and without judgment, the entire time. The Stoics did not promise that returning to that self would make your life easier. Marcus Aurelius returned to it every night and still had to govern an empire fraying at its edges, still watched people he loved die, still faced the particular exhaustion of holding ground in a world that tests it daily. Epictetus returned to it from inside a life that had given him every reason to abandon the attempt. Seneca returned to it and still, at the end, made mistakes he could not undo. They were not transformed into people who no longer suffered. They were transformed into people who knew the difference between suffering and being defined by it. That is the only transformation the Stoics ever actually promised. And it is, when you understand what it means, enough. More than enough. Because the person who knows that difference, who can feel the full weight of something without mistaking the weight for their worth, who can be moved without being relocated, who can love without requiring the love to be permanent in order for it to have been real, that person is not cold. They are simply no longer afraid of the weather. And there is a freedom in that, quiet and unheroic and entirely unspectacular from the outside, that no one can give you and nothing can take away. You have always been closer to it than you thought. The stillness that unsettled people, the composure that got you called cold, the refusal to perform distress that made you seem distant, was never absence. It was the beginning of an answer to a question you had not yet learned to ask. You know the question now. The rest is practice. If this video found you at the right moment, share it with someone who might need it. Not to explain it to them, but simply to leave it where they might find it when they are ready. And if you want to go deeper into the questions this channel keeps returning to, the ones that do not have clean answers but are worth living inside, subscribe and stay. Leave a comment with something this brought up for you, or tell me what you want us to look at next. I will be here.